yes, and they want to hear more details, and at one level it's not a very challenging proposal. But the thing that interests me is that actually Fonterra is asking them to make quite a different change in investment philosophy, because the dry shares carry a dividend which is taxable and will be variable as well. So you're asking farmers who, by instinct and successful business model, load themselves up with debt to get tax-free capital gains on their farming operations. But now you're asking them to be long-term holders of a portfolio investment which will be taxable. And so when a farmer at the end of the season has a choice of how to spend some surplus they might have, do they pay down debt, do they invest in their own farm, either to increase the productivity on a flat output, i.e. reduce their costs, or increase their output, or the fourth option is now to buy the dry shares. I would have thought the dry shares will be a fourth and rather distant choice for them.
Won't their bankers have quite a firm view on whether farmers should spend this money, if it is available to them, on buying these shares? They'll want to see some projected returns.
That's right. At the moment, the value-added return as a percentage of the cost of the dry shares is around about 9-10%, which looks okay. And for a lot of farmers, that will just cover the costs of the debt they're going to take on when they buy those shares. There are issues too that I think farmers will want more reassurance on. Because remember, we're going into a 3-step process. We're voting on the first 2 steps in November, but we don't know all the details about the 3rd step. And although Fonterra has said that the 3 steps are independent and can be taken one at a time or 2 at a time, I don't think that's the case.
Farmers will want to see all that detail,
yes,
won't they?
And I'd add one other point as well, that with a share investment, we normally expect a reasonably steady dividend. But in this case, the value return is very much knocked around by commodity prices. So as commodity prices fall, the value return element usually goes up and vice versa. So this is going to be a very volatile dividend, which only complicates the issue in terms of how farmers might value it, and indeed how their bankers might consider that asset as well.
So there might have to be quite a change in mindset there amongst farmers.
Yes, and if you look at how much of that rights issue will be taken up, I'd be surprised if it was more than 70 or 80%, given there's at least a core 10% of farmers by production who simply won't be able to afford it, and their banks won't let them buy them.
I'd actually, it's very hard to predict. I would actually push the level down below that. I mean, if they made 50% take up, I think I'd be surprised. But that's just a gut feeling.
Now it's on to Around the Traps. There's talk of a farmer revolt up north against the Super City plans amongst Wellsford farmers. What's your view, Rod? Are you a Super City fan?
In theory, yes, in terms of trying to get better governance for the region. But this is a process that's quite well and truly off the rails, because the government seems to be making all sorts of big decisions on the fly and very willing to change its views on issues depending whose last chewed its ear. Now, and we won't know the full extent of this until we get to the 3rd bill in November, which will outline how the likes of transport and economic development and other key issues are handled. It looks as though at the moment Wellington wants these to be arm's length bodies that have appointed people on them and not have them as an arm of the political process. What this means for the boundaries and for landowners on either side of the city, you really need to take a very long-term view as to how the Auckland region uses its land over the next sort of 50 or 60 years. And you could use that argument both ways. If you were a horticultural landowner down in South Auckland, you would want a very firm urban limit so you could keep horticultural farming, and that would be valuable. But on the other hand, you may be a landowner who is, your exit strategy is to sell your land for subdivision, in which case you would want a very fluid boundary. And but what underlying all this is one of the key issues, is that those questions of long-term land issues, the Resource Management Act can't cope with those, and we actually need structure plans that start to identify long-term considerations about where good land is for farming and should be preserved, where other land could be used for development. And so the real heart of it is to make sure that the new Auckland Council has a focus on that and has the powers on that to set those long-term parameters.
So farmers haven't been consulted thoroughly enough about their concerns, Bernard?
I think they're in a big group of lots of people who haven't been consulted about this. And although I agree with Rod that the super city idea seems like a good idea, and we certainly need to consolidate some of the bureaucracy and governance with the multiple city councils in Auckland, let alone the rest of the country, to reduce some of the cost growth we're getting out of local councils. Remember, councils increased their spending 10% last year. They increased rates 7.5% and fees 10%. So we need to somehow control the cost growth in councils. The government and ACT under Rodney Hyde think that a super city is the way to do that. I have yet to see any evidence to show that simply bigger means better economies of scale and lower cost growth or controlling of rates. We may actually see it a lot worse. And there's a very strong push from Wellington to get this done in a hurry. I'd actually like to see them hold back a bit and ask a few more questions. On the issue of farmers, whether they want to be inside the boundary or outside the boundary, a couple of complications here. Those people right now who want to be sheep and beef or even dairy farmers for the longer term obviously don't want the higher rates that are involved in being inside the boundaries. But then there'll also be some who are outside the boundaries but want to subdivide, who want the much lower development fees that come in being in one of these fringe, I suppose you could call it rural councils rather than a local council. Everyone is scared witless of the smart growth policies that the central Auckland government has been running, which tended to mean very high fees for development and for building consents and a whole bunch of other things, which a lot of people don't want to have a bar of.
And down south there looks to be a bit of a potential row brewing with Ravensdown's plans to set up a urea plant using Southland lignite. We've seen plans like this before, haven't we, back in the 80s, where it was suggested this resource could be exploited.
Yeah, it has that sort of Aramawana feel to it. Big idea, think big, lots of money spent. But actually have a look at the details on how hard it is to get that lignite out, how expensive it will be, how damaging to the environment it will be. Secondly, what sort of carbon emissions are we going to get out of this lignite? Mr. Elder from the coal company thinks that the carbon emissions can be sunk underground. No one's actually proven that can be done. And then you're looking at feeding urea, which essentially is energy converted to fertiliser, into New Zealand. I wonder whether this is the way we should be going, because all that urea ends up leaching through the soil and the waterways into our rivers, which are already badly polluted. I wonder whether New Zealand dairying, which is where most of this urea is going to go, and the agriculture industry needs to relook at their intense focus on slapping fertiliser onto land and boosting production that way, rather than finding some other cleverer ways which don't damage the environment, damage the waterways, and cost a lot of money.
But there would be quite a lot of benefits to Southland, wouldn't there, in terms of jobs, the actual construction of the plant. That economic benefit shouldn't be just dismissed, should it?
It needs to be weighed up very carefully, because a lot of that economic benefit is short term, i.e. only during the construction phase. And I'd like to think that the Southlanders would be wise enough to make a balanced long term view. Venture Southland is a very good economic development agency that has lots of other good ideas that it's bringing to fruition. And so there will be good debate down there in Southland as to where this fits. But in terms of a longer-term view as to whether applying more and more fertiliser to soil is the right way to go, I would argue very strongly it's not. We know we're starting to see all